us this. Okay, thank you again for coming to this exciting book launch meeting. And I wanted to particularly thank Hongwei and Shi for the invitation. I think when I got the invitation to chair this event, I felt this is such a wonderful opportunity to meet the author, as well as to meet people who genuinely interested in Chinese in Britain. I taught a course on Chinese migrations to the world. It's interesting to see, even though Britain was one of the earliest places to receive Chinese migrants. However, interestingly, when I tried to put course together, I found, compared with publications related to America, for example, the publication related to Britain relatively, just not many out there. So I think it's really, really exciting to see, Barclay give us this opportunity to explore the history with him. So I think we all here try to understand, the past, the Chinese migrant in Britain in the past, but more importantly, I think understand this kind of history allow us to see clear about our presence in Britain. So without further delay, let's crack on and have Barclay's presentation. And I think he will have to show us with his PowerPoint. So Barclay, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me to come along and talk to you by Zoom. Here's my book. And one of the things I wanted when I did the book was put in little snippets of Chinese poems. I've always been very interested in Chinese poetry. So each chapter has a poem, and it's amazing how I was able to find what I thought were particularly relevant ones, which just shows the depth of Chinese poetry. It's important to say my book is not really about immigration per se. My book runs from the first Chinese person to come to Britain over 300 years, ending in the mid-60s. And it was really after the 60s that there was a much greater number of Chinese coming to Britain. So this book, The Chinese in Britain by Benton and Gomez, covers much more the subjects of economy, migration, identity. And my book, to a large extent, talks about the visitors. It talks about the very early immigrants, the ones who perhaps less known, but it was really just to give a flavor of that wider interaction between China and Britain. But I have to apologize because I'm not an academic. I'm far from an expert in China. So how did I come to research and write this book? Well, when I retired after working in the arts for 40 years, I live in a house. I'm sitting in my house in Edinburgh in a Georgian house, although we live in the servants' quarters in the basement. And people kept saying, who lived in your house before? Because it was built in 1801. So I set off to research that. And then I ended up researching the whole street, 650 people across 200 years right across the street. And because of that, I was approached by Edinburgh World Heritage to ask if I would do little Facebook historical pieces, which I continue to do. And one day I was in Edinburgh Central Library looking for stories, usually about 250 words. And I came across the Book of Old Edinburgh, volume 14. And I literally just opened it and came across this statement. 40 to 50 years ago, there was a Chinese gentleman in the excise office with the name of William Macau. Now, this was written in 1858. So this meant that this Chinese man was in Edinburgh around 1800. So I thought, oh, well, this will make a nice little snippet for my Edinburgh World Heritage Facebook page. But actually, when I started to look, I couldn't find anything about this man, except for two references, which I'll come to later. So I will come back to Mr. Macau in a few moments, but first of all, what was the relationship of Britain to China in the early days? Well, before 1700, China was really just seen as mysterious and exotic. The little that people knew about China came from books written by travelers. This was published in 1738, an English translation of a book by Jean-Baptiste du Halde, who was a Jesuit missionary, because the Jesuits who had gone to China earlier were the ones who brought most information out about China. And then in 1670, after a number of decades of trying, Britain started to trade with China. Portugal and Holland had been trading before this, but eventually Britain got permission to set up a trading post in Canton. Although they were only able to stay there for 3 months of each year, the other 9 months they went to Macau, the Portuguese colony. And of course, the main thing they were trading was tea. And tea began to boom in Britain. It was very expensive. And that was the beginning of the trading relationship. But also, the East India Company was bringing back porcelain. In 1730, 500,000 pieces of porcelain were imported into Britain. Extraordinary concept. And it was also going into other European countries. And there was this great interest in Chinese design and Japanese design, and became highly fashionable. So there was this continuing sense of China as an exotic, interesting, mysterious place. Now, the first recorded Chinese in Britain was in 1687, Michael Alphonsus Shen Song. And he was a Chinese who had been converted to Roman Catholicism by the Jesuits. And he also learnt Latin, which was important. So he came to Europe with a Jesuit priest, Philip Couplet, and they came to see the Pope. But the Pope refused to see them. So they thought, well, we'll wait around a wee bit until he does allow us to have an audience with him. And they ended up waiting a number of years. And while they were in the continent, they came to Britain. And there was a complete wonder at this Chinese man appearing in London. He was given an audience by the king, James II, and James II commissioned this portrait. He was so captivated, and he hung it in a room next to his bedchamber. And because Shen could speak Latin, he could communicate with a number of people in Britain. So there was a dialogue. And he did a number of things, but eventually he left to travel back to China, although sadly died en route. But it was not until 1756 that the next Chinese person arrived in Britain. And he was Lum Kikwa. He was a Chinese merchant. He was in Portugal. He didn't speak Latin, and he only spoke a smattering of Portuguese. So when he came to London, he had great difficulty in communicating with anybody. But like Shen, he was taken for an audience with the king, George II, and had his portrait painted. But he didn't stay long. He went back to Portugal. The next was 1769, Tan Chikwa. He was a sculptor, and he worked in Canton. Now, it's important to say that at this time, no Chinese were allowed to travel out of China without the emperor's permission, and nobody was encouraged to go very far. But Tan had sold quite a lot of his rather wonderful half-size sculptures of portraits of people to British people who were working in Canton, and he fancied seeing London. And he'd learnt a bit of English. So he pretended he was traveling to Sumatra, but he kept on going and arrived in London. And when he arrived in London, he actually set up a workshop and began making his sculptures in London. And again, he was taken up by the intelligentsia and the social set. He too met the king, George III. He also had his portrait painted, and he was even invited to exhibit one of his sculptures at the Royal Academy's exhibition. So these Chinese were really making waves of interest whenever they appeared. Around the same time, Wang Yitong came. He was brought by an East India Company employee. And my book has deeper stories about these people. He was only 17, and he too became a minor celebrity. He had his portrait painted as well, and served as a page as the Duke of Dorset's mistress at Knowle House in Kent. And then my discoveries were that William Mackay had arrived in 1778, but he was unknown. He didn't appear in any of the talks about early Chinese. He clearly had never met the king. There was nothing written up about him. Why not? Well, then I discovered that he was brought to Scotland. This took me quite a lot of research, by Dr. David Urquhart when he was about 20. And the reason nobody knew about him was because he went to be a servant at Bray Langwell, an estate on the Black Isle in Inverness, 600 miles from London. Now, sadly, nothing is traceable about where he came from in China, why he came to Britain, how he was allowed to, or how Dr. David Urquhart came across him. His name rather suggests to me that he probably came from Macau, but I can't say that for certain. All I've been able to find out is what happened once he arrived in Scotland. Now, Thomas Lockhart, who was a commissioner of the Board of Excise, was married to Henrietta Gordon of Newhall. And as you'll see from this map, it was a neighbouring estate to Bray Langwell. And in 1778, Lockhart employed Mackay as his footman and took him to Edinburgh. And this is the first documented record of William Mackay. You can see it's spelled C-A-W in this because that's the way it was heard. And he worked at the Lockhart's house, a very posh house in George Square. What is rather odd is, although even James Boswell dined at the house and must have come across Mackay, he never mentioned him. Nobody mentioned him, although he does appear in other documented records. In 1781, Lockhart died, and that was a bit of a problem for Mackay, but fortunately, Lockhart's wife got him a job as an assistant for male servants at the Board of Excise, and he worked at Chesil's Court, which still exists in Edinburgh. And he then married Helen Ross. Now, it's probably, or it's absolutely certain that the Urquharts and the Gordons must have arranged this. Helen Ross's father was having financial problems, and if a father was having financial problems, it was quite hard for the daughters to get married. So that may have been the reason that Helen was allowed to marry William Mackay, the only Chinese person in Scotland at this time, the only Chinese person in Britain. But he had a job. He was now working for the Board of Excise. And more importantly, as I'll come back to, he had become baptized into the Protestant Church, which was critical. So this marriage was arranged, and they had 2 daughters and a son. But sadly, in 1801, Helen died, giving birth to a 4th child. In 1787, the Board of Excise moved to Dundas House, which is now Royal Bank in St Andrews Square, and Mackay began to have a career. He was promoted to assistant clerk, became one of the accountants, as you can see from that extract from the Edinburgh Directory. He was appointed Junior Accountant General, and then appointed Accountant of the Superannuation Fund. Now, if a Scot had been a servant in an estate in the north of Scotland and progressed to be Accountant of the Superannuation Fund, that would have been remarkable. For a Chinese man to have done it was just absolutely extraordinary. So much so that some people have said, is this really true? And I can assure you all the records are there, and it is true. Mackay retired in 1826, age 73. Just going back, he was probably baptized about 1777, and he actually was a member and an elder of Rose Street Burger Church in Edinburgh. He was also involved in an extraordinary court case in 1818, and I'm only going to give you a teaser because you'll need to get the book, but basically he took on the government to see if he was a British national. it's a very complicated story, and we don't have enough time because there's other things, but fascinating. And actually, legally, William Macaw is the only person in Scotland to ever, since the Act of Union, to have been made legally a Scot. Everybody else was legally British. So you'll need to read the book to find out that little puzzle. So he died in Edinburgh in 1831 and is buried in St. Cuthbert's graveyard, and his grave is there. So not only was William Macaw a remarkable man, but he actually is the first Chinese to settle in Britain, to become a Protestant, to marry a British woman, and to work in Britain. And the fact that up until my research stumbled across this, that he had gone unknown, is just amazing. And my plan is to get a plaque put in the wall where he died, the house, and I'm hoping to do that next year. So moving along, the next Chinese to come to Britain were entertainers. The Chinese jugglers came about 1813, and like all the Chinese jugglers, they did a bit of magic, some acrobatics, and juggling. And they came quite close to Nottingham. They appeared at Mansfield with tolerable good success. And they toured around Britain, and over the next decades, other Chinese juggling groups came to Britain. In 1848, a Chinese junk, the Keying, came to Britain. It had a rather extraordinary journey. It was blown off course on its way from Hong Kong and ended up in New York. And it was some months before it could come on to Britain. And when it arrived in Britain, it was a huge success. Queen Victoria visited it, all the other socialites visited it, and very, very popular. So China was still considered exotic. Queen Victoria had an audience with a Chinese musical family that came in 1851, and this is her sketch she made of them when they were with her. Now, they were not quite what they were seen to be, but what was fascinating for most people about them was these were the second Chinese ladies ever to be seen in Britain, and of course people were fascinated by their bound feet. Chang Wu was another Chinese man who became a great star in Britain. He was brought by a Glaswegian musician, Marcus Chisholm, who was one of the first people to take a piano to Japan. He came home via China, saw this great tall man who was almost 7 feet high in Shanghai, and thought, I can make money from this. So he brought Chang Wu, and with him he brought a Chinese dwarf, and he also brought a woman who was purported to be Chang Wu's wife. But actually she wasn't his wife, because he later married a woman from Liverpool. And when Marcus gave up managing him, Chang Wu toured the world. He went to Australia, he went to America, and he ended up living in Eastbourne, where he had a house with special doors made so as he could walk between rooms. And he performed in Nottingham, although sadly not to a very large audience, which seems a shame. But normally he was hugely popular. So also at this time, Britain was trying to make diplomatic overtures to China, but the first two were rebuffed. And part of the problem was the East India Company's opium trade. Britain was importing vast amounts of tea, and basically the East India Company did not have enough money to pay for all the tea. And therefore they started illegally exporting opium into China. They did it through a network of subsidiaries to keep it illegal. And of course, there's a detrimental impact on China. There was also another problem in that British Protestant missionaries were starting to go into China, and these were opposed by the Chinese government. So the opium trade and this attempt to bring Christianity to China eventually caused huge tensions and led to the outbreak of the Opium Wars. Clearly, it's more complex than that, but briefly, China was trying to stop the opium trade, and Britain and other European countries and America decided to go to war to basically ensure the opium trade could continue. The war had mixed views in Britain. Lots of people opposed it, but it didn't stop it. And of course, the defeat of China had two impacts which were important to later immigration. The first was that Hong Kong became a British colony. The Hong Kong and the New Territories, Britain took it, and it was in Hong Kong that Protestant mission schools began to emerge, and lots of the Chinese who came through Hong Kong. The other was that China had to allow Protestant missionaries to come to China. And here, James Legge has got a photograph taken in dollar with the Chinese man Wang Tao, who came to Britain to help Legge translate Chinese books into English. And Wang Tao wrote a wonderful, wonderful journal about his time in Britain, some of which I've reproduced in the book. And also, Legge had the Bible translated into Chinese, so that began to spread the Christian word in China. Now, the Opium Wars were when the first stirrings of xenophobia began. This piece, written about the Kiang, nothing but a floating toy shop, a risible invention of a stagnant country, etc. Who wrote this? Charles Dickens. So people were beginning to have an anti-Chinese view, and even worse was appearing in newspapers: insolence, arrogance, malevolence. And this view was fed by some, far from all, of the East India Company men working in Canton and Hong Kong. They were basically objecting to the Chinese trying to block opium trade, and therefore saw them as insolent and arrogant. So these were the first stirrings, but on the other side, most of the Chinese who were coming to Britain, I will come to the sailors in a moment, were not finding they were being opposed. They probably had the odd moment of racism, etc. But on the whole, they were welcomed. They were positively written up in newspapers. Here was, in 1855, the first ever Chinese student to graduate outside China. Wang became a doctor studying at Edinburgh University. And when he graduated, every newspaper in the country carried a positive piece. Similarly, when Robert Legge brought three boys from Hong Kong to study, first in Leicester and then at the Dollar Academy, they toured around Britain, and huge numbers of people went to hear them, although they were rather surprised to discover they had Scottish accents like me. But they all went back to China. People tended not to stay.
Hands, please.
Sorry? Oh. So the fascination with China continued. In 1883, when the sea fishing exhibition was opened, the first ever Chinese restaurant for the public was part of it, and people flocked to try that. Of course, there was little snidey comments about Chinese eating, but on the whole, it was positive.
Excuse me, could anyone close the mic, please, if you haven't turned it off? Thanks.
So diplomatic relations began to be established. Queen Victoria met Bin Chung, first envoy from the Qing government, in 1866. And in 1877, the first Chinese ambassador was appointed. So you had this mixed picture of xenophobia. Me? Is that okay?
Yes, it's okay. Sorry, I just unmuted everyone. Sorry.
I see. Am I okay?
Yes, it's fine now.
Okay. So the origins of London's Chinatown, the Guardian piece, which is well worth reading, and I'll touch on later, say that Liverpool was the first community, which is not the case. It was London. And it began, East India Company began employing Chinese sailors around 1780. Now, those sailors sailed from China to London, and because of the trade winds, the ships didn't sail back to China for about another 3 or 4 months. So about 200 or 300 Chinese sailors were often in London's Limehouse waiting for the ship. But there were itinerants. And to deal with this, the East India Company brought John Anthony to London to basically manage accommodation for these Chinese and look after them. And he made a huge sum of money, so much so that he was able to buy naturalization. The only way you could become a naturalized Brit at this time was through an act of parliament, which was hugely expensive. But John Anthony did, but sadly died 2 months after the act was passed. But even at this time, even up to 1857, it was still almost no development of London's Chinatown. There was still about 200 sailors, including lots of Indian sailors who were by 1857 put up in the Strangers' Home, but none of them were staying. They were all based in this very small part of London, and slowly this began to evolve into Liverpool and a little bit into Cardiff. So the first record I've been able to track for a Chinese become naturalized, when it was, by now there was a cheaper method, was John Acker. And he appears in the 1871 census. There's a lot more people born in China who appear in these early census, but they were British people born in China. He's the first Chinese, and he had a shop in Great Peter Street. Interestingly, not in Limehouse, whereas most of the others were. So by about 1900, there was a small Chinatown. It was not just Chinese. There was Jewish immigrants. There was immigrants from India. There was immigrants from the Middle East. And there was probably about 2 or 3 Chinese boarding houses, maybe 1 or 2 Chinese shops, 1 or 2 restaurants. It was tiny, probably only about 80 permanent residents. But they stuck there. They weren't moving out of that area. As I say, eventually it began to evolve in Liverpool as more boats sailed into Liverpool. Chinese restaurant in Liverpool in 1910, Pennyfields Road in London, 1929, and the early Chinese laundries. I'll come back to why Chinese laundries, but they were the first businesses outside restaurants and shops and boarding houses to appear. Now, it was at this point that the xenophobia really began to increase, but it was really focused on the docks. It was to do with the seamen. There was an anti-Chinese attitude stirred up by the National Sailors and Farmers Union because British seamen believed that the Chinese seamen were going to take their jobs. It was a time of unemployment, so this was bound to cause tension. And this led to some riots. In 1911, in Cardiff, all the city's Chinese laundries were attacked and smashed. There was some violence against Chinese, but of course, if you know about America, where it was virulent and Chinese were hung, murdered, burnt to death, there was not that. Chinese were attacked, but there was no deaths. But it was still extremely unpleasant for the seamen who were working in those areas. The press began to pick up on this, but their attacks were more at the opium dens. There was this complete misperception that the East End of London and to a lesser extent Liverpool were full of opium dens. Now, the fact was that opium had been exported from Britain by East India Company from India to China, and also many people in Britain used drugs. In fact, during the First World War, you could go to Harrods and order opium to be sent to your soldier brother or friend in the trenches. The Chinese were also accused of illegal gambling. Well, at this time, 80% of British were involved in illegal gambling. But the main thing that the press talked about was the entrapment of white women through drugs. Now, again, this was a complete nonsense. Of course, there were some white women, some British women who married Chinese, but a number of them, when interviewed, said, well, actually, I have to say my Chinese husband is far better than most of the British husbands my friends have. So this began to stimulate a complete misperception. So although there was this anti-Chinese seamen, when the First World War came around, because many of the seamen were required for other duties, the Chinese seamen were welcomed back onto the boats and the opposition was suspended. Also, there's this extraordinary story that the British and the French advertised in China for men to come to Europe to work with them. And 20,000 Chinese were employed in the Chinese Labour Corps. What they weren't told was they were coming to be in the middle of a violent war. Now, they didn't come to be soldiers, but they came to pick up discarded shells, deal with the dead bodies, take things up to the line. Many died because of that in the fighting. And as the Guardian piece today is talking about the Second World War, the same happened in the First. Of all these men, quite a few said, we would like to come and live and work in Britain. Not one was allowed into Britain. They were all repatriated. Only one made it to Britain, who I write about in the book, and he did it illegally. Probably there was a few others who made it illegally, but the British government just said, no, go away. Also, there was this portrayal of China in caricature. So the xenophobia began to drift into this. Now, of course, Aladdin, but it had, Widow Twankey who ran the Chinese laundry. It was all ha-ha, jokey, but it began to be taken to a deeper, more nasty extent. Books like The Yellow Danger, Limehouse Nights, Tales of Chinatown, which talked about drugs, talked about gambling. And then it led to, of course, the Chinese man as the evil man trying to take over the world, Dr. Fu Manchu. This reached such a peak, and I have a couple of chapters about the cultural shift about China, that in the 1920s, the Chinese ambassador wrote to the government saying there are about 14 plays on in London, all with an evil Chinese as the lead character. Surely this should be stopped. Of course, it wasn't. Yet, although there was this side to it, the visitors who arrived, again, when they came from the upper professional middle classes, were taken into people's houses, happily accepted, lauded. Zhu Zimo, who came to study in Cambridge, of course, wrote his very famous poem, Second Farewell to Cambridge. Gwen Hoing became a much-loved Wimbledon tennis player. Crowds flocked to see her. Qiang Yi, who came to Britain and lived here for a number of years and wrote wonderful books, the Silent Traveller series. And he writes in his books about, going about Britain in his Chinese costume, being happily taken up by people, having great chats with people, although he does, towards the end of his career, write about that it was difficult, that he was not being able to use his own language was a barrier much of the time. So of course these Chinese would have had some forms of racism, but on the whole they were welcomed. Mr. and Mrs. Koo, Mr. Koo came as the Chinese ambassador in the 1920s. I mean, they were taken up by all the great socialites. They were photographed for all the top magazines of the day, talked about in all the social columns. So you had this two-way traffic. The seamen, the people living in Limehouse, in Liverpool, Chinatown, were probably coming up against a lot of racism, but the other Chinese who were coming were not really. Now, immigration between the wars was still quite small. A few Chinese sailors left their ships and started to live in Britain. But it was a handful, really. And this is when we saw them beginning to open Chinese laundries. Now, the reason that the Chinese moved into Chinese laundries was probably twofold. First of all, few of them spoke English very well. There was also a resistance, even if they had gone, to try to get employment. So, and you could set up a Chinese laundry fairly cheaply. You found a shop, you didn't need much equipment, and a lot of them married a British woman, and she could speak to the customers while the Chinese man and the wife and their children worked in the laundry day in, day out. I've written a whole piece about one person's experience of writing in the laundry, and it was a grim life. They worked dreadful hours. But outside the small Chinatowns, there was only, that I could track, 3 Chinese restaurants before the war. One in Edinburgh, one in Oxford, and a few others in Soho. About 3 or 4 or 5 in Soho. So the Chinese were still a very small number in Britain. Now, the Guardian piece, which is well worth reading, I mean, I have a chapter about the same material, but you can read the Guardian easier, talks about the Second World War. Now, the difference in the Second World War was that China was an ally of Britain. China was fighting the Japanese, so of course they were an ally. And there was huge support for China. Don't buy Japanese toys, a boycott. There's a boycott of Japanese oil, and large sums of money were sent to China from Britain to support the Chinese war effort. So when the Chinese seamen became employed on the merchant ships and on Royal Navy ships, they were lauded. Many, many, many died in the war. But the other impact on the Chinese community in Britain was that still the great majority were living in the docks, and that was where most of the German bombing took place. So large numbers of Chinese businesses, houses were bombed during the war. Now, the same thing happens at the end of the Second World War. The support for these Chinese falls away. As the Guardian recounts, Chinese seamen were repatriated. Even those who had married British women were just picked up off the street and sent back to China. Their wives and children never saw them again. The other impact was that because of the bombing, the government decided to rebuild, particularly in Liverpool, new houses, but they drove the Chinese out. They didn't want the Chinese taking the houses because they were seen to bring the neighbourhood down. But it was different in London. In London, the Limehouse was so flattened that really that was ended the Chinatown of London. It moved to Soho, but that was completely different. It wasn't the Limehouse moved to Soho. Limehouse just pretty disappeared. Probably by 1950, 40 or 50 Chinese living there. Nobody's quite sure. So the immigration post 1950, it's from that point that more Chinese begin to come into Britain. And here, the Com Nam, an early restaurant in Nottingham. Now, the reason that the Chinese began to move into Chinese food is, again, because the ones who came to be with relations or got jobs with friends or came from the same town in Hong Kong, New Territories. So they went into the restaurant business. The Chinese, I don't think, were trying to get jobs outside of this. And of course, this was an easy path for Chinese who spoke little, if any, English. because they went to work in the kitchen and could communicate in Chinese. The Chinese laundries began to fade away, and many of the people who were running Chinese laundries then opened restaurants. Now, unlike the other immigrant groups who were coming to Britain, from the West Indies, from Pakistan, from India, the other British colonies, they didn't have the same approach. They came in larger groups. They began to set up sort of communities, and they spoke some English, and they began to get jobs, bus drivers, in hospitals, etc. The Chinese, because almost without exception, and also most coming at this time were single men, the women didn't come until later, so they were very isolated. And they were even more isolated because to have a Chinese laundry or a Chinese restaurant, to make it economically viable, you had to disseminate it. So you had one restaurant perhaps in Nottingham, one restaurant in Glasgow, one restaurant in Thurso. And this meant that for quite a long time, the Chinese were dispersed and didn't form early on the same communities that began to be formed by the West Indians, the Pakistanis, and the Indians. I'm sure there are other socio-economic reasons, but that seems to me the main one. But slowly they began to emerge. Now, Soho happened by chance, according to the person I quote in my book. There was these few restaurants, a few more began to feed in, other businesses started to go there, and it began to expand. And that was true of the other Chinatowns that now exist. But they came late. They come post my book. They really start to happen in the 1970s, 80s, even as late as the 1990s. There were still Chinese visitors coming. Here, a Chinese visiting group to Nottingham in 1950, coming to go down Bestwood Colliery. And a lot of the Chinese visitors who came were taken down mines. I don't quite know why, but their tours were not necessarily interesting. But I have a lot in my book about what these Chinese thought or where they were taken, and quite fascinating. I love the one about one Chinese who came, was taken to London Zoo and couldn't work out why they didn't have any dragons. And he thought it was probably because they were mythical creatures and hard to catch. So those conflicts of culture are fascinating. But by the 1940s, some visitors did begin to stay. Here are a few examples to finish my talk. Kenneth Lowe, came in 1940s. He worked in Liverpool for a time, working with his local seamen. He had been the champion of tennis in North China, so he was a great tennis player. He then moved to London, and somebody suggested, because there was little Chinese cookbooks, that he write one, and he wrote Cooking the Chinese Way and was amazed when it sold 10,000 copies. And he happened to be teaching tennis to the son of Egan Ronnie, who ran the Good Food Guide. And Egan Ronnie discovered that Kenneth Lowe knew about Chinese food. So he asked Kenneth if he would become the Chinese food critic for the Good Food Guide. And Ken Lowe writes this wonderful piece. He said, in the early 1960s, I ate at more Chinese restaurants than anyone in his right mind would want to. The quantity of indifferent food that I had to eat was quite alarming. And of course, at this time, Chinese restaurants in Britain in the 60s were serving chips and Chinamen because that's what the British customers knew. It was not until later that proper traditional Chinese food began to be sold. And of course, Ken Lowe was one of the great people to develop that. Young Chang, she was one of the first Chinese students to be allowed out of the People's Republic of China, and she arrived in Britain in 1976. She studied at York, and in 1982 was the first person from People's Republic of China to be awarded a PhD from a British university. She decided to stay, and she married, and of course in 1991 published Wild Swans. This was the highest selling non-fiction paperback of its time, selling more than 20 million copies and being translated into 38 languages, but as I understand, remains banned in the People's Republic of China to this day. Charles Cow was born in Shanghai, and he moved to Hong Kong with his family in 1948. He wanted to study electrical engineering, couldn't do that in Hong Kong, so came to Britain. And he writes about arriving. I was 19 years old and had never before left my family to be my own. Everything was a new experience. The British Council staff met me in London and arranged to take me to lodgings in Plumstead, where I was near Woolwich Polytechnic. Now, he'd enrolled there because he needed to get A levels before he could do a degree, so he studied at Woolwich Polytechnic, got his A levels, and decided to study there for a degree. But after that, he needed to earn money. So he got a job with Standard Telephone and Cables in North Woolwich in London. And he was working on microwave projects. And he then moved to a job with Standard Telephone and Cables, Standard Telephone in Harlow, where he began pioneering work in fibre optics, and that led to his groundbreaking work, which helped lead to the internet, and for which he won the Nobel Prize. In the early 1960s, when Hong Kong was being flooded by refugees fleeing the communist China fighting, many struggling families placed their babies in already overcrowded orphanages. And to ease the problem, the authorities arranged for a number of the foundlings to be taken and adopted by Asian American families, but they only wanted boys. So there was a large number of orphaned girls, and it was arranged that British families would be recruited to adopt. And 104 Chinese babies, infants, were adopted by British families. And this is a photograph of some of them arriving at Heathrow Airport. Again, there was massive positive publicity about this. And one of these orphans was Lucy Sheen. And Lucy Sheen became an actress, and she starred in the 1986 film Ping Pong, which was the first British Chinese film that truly touched on the theme of British Chinese struggling to integrate with British culture while trying to retain their Chinese cultural heritage. Now, the story of these orphans is extremely interesting, and Lucy writes about it, and I've reproduced some of her writing, because of course they were absolutely split between these two cultures. They grew up in British families, didn't speak Chinese, so when they came across the Chinese communities, they felt displaced. They felt, because they couldn't communicate, very odd. So my book ends in 1969. My book tries to give a flavor of the variety of people who came to China, the very many positive aspects about the Chinese in Britain, which is an attempt in a small way to address the xenophobia, which, as we sadly know, still exists today, and in the last year or so has only grown worse. Thank you very much. I now hand you over to questions.
Right. Okay, Barclay, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for such wonderful speech with marvelous images. Thank you. If it's okay, could you unshare the screen so people can see you better? Yeah. Okay. If you could unshare the screen.
It's a stop sharing button.
I've stopped
at the bottom. It's really lovely image. Thank you.
Yes.
I have stopped sharing, I think.
Okay. Right. So let's start with the questions because we see quite very lively chat while Barclay was talking. But I'm going to slightly exercise the privilege of a chair here. By asking perhaps 2 quick questions, if it's okay.
Yeah.
So Barclay, my first question is because you actually wrote, you actually contributed numerous articles to journals and magazines. So my first question to you is whether you can share with us the kind of writing topics like this compared with your previous works. Can you tell us what's a big difference in your experience?
Sorry.
And the second question. Yeah, the second question is you nicely break this book into 2 main sections. The first one is 1687 to 1900, and then the second part is 1901 to 1987. Could you tell us, because as a historian, 1900s is such an eventful year. 1900, 1901 in China is obviously the Boxer uprisings. But can you reflect on why you actually choose 1900, 1901 as a breaking point? Yeah, so those 2 questions. And then after Barclay answer the questions, I will I will look at the chat room and mention some questions, okay, or even invite the people who ask questions to turn your camera on and ask Barclay yourself. So thank you.
I think I only caught the second question, so I'll come back. Well, I have to admit, when I first wrote my first draft of the book, it ended in 1900, because actually that was easier to cope with, because basically my book pretty much captures everybody up to 1900. And the way I did this was basically by, thank goodness of digitization. I mean, this book could not have been written 15 years ago, because I was able to go through almost all the British newspapers searching under the word Chinese, Chinese doctor, Chinese sailor, Chinese, and then I used other sources. When I took it to a publisher, they said, no, we'd like you to bring it up to date. So I panicked, because I thought, well, it's such a big subject. But then when I started to look, I realized that I could take the next period through to 1967 by choosing not everybody, but a number of kind of key people. But it also did make, you're right, it did make a split, because up to 1900, really, there had been no Chinese communities in Britain. It was a few individuals coming. And the real shift started after 1900. So it was a lucky arbitrary split, but it was a split that kind of came about from that. Sorry, your first question, I didn't quite catch.
Yes, the first question was because you actually contributed, wrote quite numerous articles, for journals and magazines. So you yourself is a very experienced author, writer. So could you share with us that compare with your previous projects, what's the most remarkable moment or different experience by writing this Chinese topic? Yeah.
Well, this was memorable because this is actually my first published book. So, that was memorable in itself. I think, well, there was one interesting downside. When I was first writing it, particularly, I first of all wrote the biography of William Macau. I mean, that's how I started. And I was rather surprised that I couldn't get anybody interested in this. I contacted the Confucius Institute in Edinburgh, and they weren't, I didn't get any response. And I was rather thrown by this, because I thought, I found this wonderful story. And then I began to feel a bit ambivalent, because I thought, well, what right have I to be starting to research this or write it? But always had a strong ego. I thought, well, I'll power on, because otherwise somebody else might write it before I get it to published. So my great moment was getting a publisher, because, it's hard to get a publisher. I tried a couple. And because it's not academic, in fact, for the Chinese version, I had to go back through and put all the notes back in. So I now do have a version with all the notes for it. And I'm always hoping there might be a second edition, in which case I could, and correct with quite a number of mistakes in it. That was a great moment. And then, you know, I got contacted by lots of universities after this and other groups to go and talk. And William McCow, I believe now, is in the record. So I feel the greatest thing I've done when I go and visit his grave, which I do once in a blue moon because I walk past there, is to say to William McCow, people know about you now. People know you were the first Chinese person to leave China and come to Britain and make a mark, which is remarkable.
Great, thank you. Excellent. So I shouldn't keep all to myself. So I'm going to invite, because we have a lot of questions, so I'm going to invite David. David, so if you would like to ask question yourself, and then maybe Pek San Tan would like to ask questions too. If you're happy to turn your camera on and ask the questions. So David.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the fantastic talk. It was very illuminating and very important and timely, I think, for our community. So thank you for all your brilliant research and great work. I think given the history of colonialism and racism our community has faced for decades, centuries really, in this country, how can we collectively push back against the current scapegoating and xenophobia that has led to such a kind of a spike in hate speech and hate crimes and attacks against our community up and down the country? What kind of, other than, you know, the wonderful education that you're currently doing, what do you feel collectively our communities can do to push back and to change the current narrative against us?
Well, David, I'm diffident to, you know, speak too much about this because I'm not an expert, but I've worked in the arts for a long time. I worked in the early arts, what we call community arts, worked in sort of disadvantaged community in London's East End. I was also involved with a very early project to do with bringing people from different musicians from different cultures to a festival in Britain. And one of the things having written this book, I've noted, and I think it's important, is how seldom you see Chinese people in cultural artifacts, in films, in plays, and a lot has been written about that. The Black community now become assimilated. Nobody thinks twice very much for a Black actor to be in a Shakespeare, to play a lead. So I think clearly you can't change that, but I think that's an important area for the Chinese community to work on, is that being seen in different perception on thing, because, you know, actresses and actors talk about they're always cast as, it's lucky it's a doctor, but more likely it's a drug dealer, and there's still that. I think the other thing that, I've not come across many Chinese people, and I think there still is an element, compared with some other cultures, the Chinese community still probably is quite in their strong in their own communities, perhaps. That is yet to spread out and become more socially diverse. But of course, that's changing with first, second, third generation Chinese, which I don't touch on. But I think until, I think it's really important, and I think that there's still racism against Black people and against Indians and Pakistani people, but I think that they're seen in a kind of broader way in culture. And as somebody who's worked in culture, I think that is one of the key things. And that's why in my book, I try to talk, basically I try to write stories. I try to turn these people into stories, because any one of them could make an interesting story. I think it's telling the stories, for me, is one of the important things. But
totally agree.
No, I'm not an expert.
Okay, thank you, David. And then we call a lot of questions. I try to catch your names as much as I can. Maybe next one we can have Pek San Tan ask question, and then follow Flo and Joshua. Joshua has his hand raised. So Park San Tan, would you like to ask your questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Barclay, for that very, very interesting talk. And I echo my colleague David's comments. It was very well researched. And mine comes from your research, as you had spoken about it. So looking back at history, with the protests, starting the process with the seamen over the recession, the repatriation of the Chinese sailors, and the media portrayal in particular of sinister Chinese characters. What is your opinion of the current COVID-19 race rhetoric and the early news of the Wuhan virus? I mean, like that was the title they gave it at the beginning. I'd actually seen guidance notes that were sent to schools heading it as the Wuhan virus at the time. And this migrating to the China flu by Trump. This kind of discriminatory thread feels like an echo of the previous type of discrimination we've seen, except for utilizing media and utilizing social media and utilizing the news in a different way. So in a different sort of tone to David, I want to know whether from both an educator point of view, whether what we need to do is to challenge the history books in our education system to normalize the East Asian and Chinese experience in the UK. Like you had mentioned, you don't see many Chinese people in media, but actually what you don't see either is the contribution of this community to the war effort. You don't see the contribution of this community into commerce. We don't see the recognition of the very first Scottish Chinese making it to the top of the treasury. These are historical moments that are breaking through glass ceilings from a race point of view. Do we need a change in education in order to ensure that our community is represented as it should be in its contribution to this country?
I think all I can say is I hope that what I've managed to do is start something. I mean, my book is there to be used by people to exactly for that point, to highlight these very positive stories. I mean, the Guardian article is helpful in a way, but it does, I mean, I think what worries me is most of the stuff I've seen is still about, you know, these early Chinatowns, which really, you know, weren't really that significant. I mean, they were significant for the people who lived there, but they weren't significant in the broader sense of Chinese assimilating into Britain. So, you know, the more that other people can pick up and tell that wider, richer history, the better. But, you know, I mean, one knows that tackling racism is extremely hard and takes a long time. And, you know, I mean, I grew up in Glasgow and Protestants, Catholics are still fighting with each other. So, you know, there is this tendency for people to struggle. But I think the difference is, of course, the easiness to spot that somebody's different and that difference. So please, you know, tell other people some of these stories and try and spread the word about the positive Chinese.
Absolutely, yes, I totally agree with you. So Joshua, would you like to go ahead, ask your questions?
Thank you, and thanks very much, Barclay, for sharing such a wonderful story. And I'm fascinated about this earliest visitors from China came to England in late 17th century. And I can't imagine that. I knew that the date was, I knew the first visitors came around that area because many years ago, one of my students did a project, which, I was working the Department of Art, and he was making a mock sort of suitcase for the very first visitor from China. And when I examined the work, I simply say that the suitcase is too new. It's impossible for like 300-400 years ago. But at that time, I was really interested in to know, you know, when the first people came and they speak a very different language, for example. I mean, the time changes dramatically, right? I came to England just over 20 years ago, and look at the students nowadays. They've got a load of students come from China. They go to supermarket together. they know where's the Chinese restaurant. They can easily take the advantage. But you know, when we're talking about anti-racism, and we do have a Chinese community that we can share and we can understand each other within this group. However, 300, 400 years ago, the loneliness, the isolation mentally, you know, do you have any more story about this earlier visitors?
Well, I think, I mean, they're kind of different ones. There's lots in the book. I think the thing is, most of them came in and were given a sort of structure. A lot of them, say, came through the Hong Kong missionaries, came through the mission schools. So they had been at the mission schools in Hong Kong, so they had to kind of learn English and came speaking English. I think people, because they were still seen as sort of different, they weren't a threat because there were so few of them. I think, you know, that sort of racial threat becomes when there's many appear to be coming and displacing particularly jobs. They were welcomed, they were helped, they were given time, but of course, you know, they must, I mean, Charles Cow, you know, I mean, we're not talking that long ago, but he writes about how lonely he was sitting with his landlady in Plumstead, having to deal with different food. And I think any of us who've traveled, you know, I mean, I've got to be careful. I went to China a very long time ago. And the danger is you're just confronted with this kind of, you know, completely, the world almost turned upside down at first. So it must have been very hard. There are some lovely things in the book, like the man who couldn't work out why there was no dragons in London Zoo. I mean, he writes quite a lot about these sort of changes. The thing I found was fascinating, of course, they found much about Britain that was hugely positive, particularly the role of women in Britain. They were absolutely stunned by how women had relative equality. I mean, we're talking 19th century, but, you know, completely different. So they learned stuff and went back. But the kind of one thing that was certain was very few Chinese stayed. It was felt wrong to stay. They had to go back to China, as I understand it, partly because of honoring their ancestors. So they kind of were always longing for China, I think. So that's a long-winded way. But there are bits in the book about how some of the people wrote about it, which is all we have.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Barclay.
Barclay, I'm afraid we can't let you go yet. We still have a few more questions. For example, Flo would like me to ask, because she can't really speak, could you tell us why, according to your observation, why Chinese visitors seems to be quite popular in this country, whereas Chinese migrants were not so popular or welcomed by this country? The second question I want to join with Flo, this question is, I wonder whether my personal observation was Chinese people in this country tend to be quite a silent group. Even in terms of population, it's quite substantial population, but Chinese people tend to be relatively quiet and silent in this country, whether you share the same observation or not.
Well, I mean, I think the reason that the kind of, most of the visitors, the middle class, the professionals, the students, etc., I mean, most of them spoke English. So in a sense, they could communicate. The problem is that most of the Chinese, the seamen, even the early people in Chinese restaurants and laundries didn't speak much English. So they were cut off by language, which very, very difficult. And therefore weren't able to integrate or begin to integrate socially. And there are certainly a few stories, I mean, I've read later, you know, first generation Chinese who had gone to school and then spoke English, and they felt kind of, they were beginning to kind of integrate across, but they didn't take the parents across. So that clearly has changed in the last, you know, 20, 30 years. But I think the kind of racism grew out of, as I say, the people, working men saw a threat, and they were the ones who therefore became more bothered about it. And the press, well, the horrible press are always ready to pick up to have negative stories about anybody they can choose, and still do, you know. It's always been thus.
Yes, yes. Thank you. We have Taylor raised her hand. Yeah, Taylor, would you like to come in? Ask questions.
Thank you very much for this fantastic event. My question is, for the ones that stay in the 1940s, are they considered British citizens? In the U.S., as long as you're born in the U.S., it's birthright citizenship. But is that the case for the slide where you had all the immigrants who stayed in the 1940s? Are they considered Chinese citizens, or can they be naturalized to become British citizens?
Yeah, well, of course, the whole Windrush affair that's much in the press. I mean, people from British colonies were offered a British passport in the 1950s if they came. People who can become naturalized have been able to do so since 1870s, when it became a slightly simpler process. And then as in America, a child of the Chinese born in Britain is a British citizen. So, I mean, the problem in the early 50s was, of course, lots of them were illegal, and basically didn't speak enough English to find out from anybody how to go about it. So they just kept their heads down. And then when they were discovered, that's when the problems came. And there wasn't, and the very difficult thing was, I mean, this is an extraordinary in my book, is that when some British women married Chinese, they lost their citizenship. Which, I mean, I couldn't believe that when I read that. So by marrying a Chinese, they lost. But it wasn't just Chinese. That was true of other people who were called, up until quite recently, aliens. They were called foreign aliens.
That's the case in the U.S. as well. Irish women who marry Chinese men would lose their citizenship.
Terrible.
Yeah. There's incredible similarities between what happened to the Chinese in Britain and in the U.S.
I think the different in the U.S. Because the numbers of Chinese who went to America was huge. I mean, they went to help build the railroads, etc. The violence against them was all the stronger because they really were seen to be sort of invading. The numbers in Britain were always so small that although there was these pockets of violence, it never permeated too far. And the stories, some of the stories I've read about Chinese in America, just, horrific, But on the other hand, of course, that has led to Chinese, as I was talking about culturally, integrating far more. I mean, you see lots of people from Asian backgrounds in American films, American television, far more than you see in Britain.
What you said earlier, the question earlier, I forgot who it was, but that I think because of the huge population of the big, relatively speaking, of the Chinese immigrants to America, their contributions, I think, to America was very outsized. For example, I read very recently that I think the early immigrants fed were in agriculture, and they fed up to 70% or 75% of the population of the state of California. And those are just the accomplishments that we are, a few of the accomplishments that we're aware of. So I think for us in the US, I think there's what will help contain that violence is understanding for the general population, to understand that, like many other immigrants, how much, the Chinese contributed to the building of America that most people are not taught. I don't know about Britain, but that would seem to certainly help in some way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that's a very interesting comparison. I totally agree with Taylor's observation. Well, perhaps the more conversation can be, continue after the talk. So if you could, whether Taylor would like to leave your email address so we can put in touch. Thank you, in the chat room. Okay. Now, I'm a bit conscious about the time. So perhaps I would like to leave the final question to, Dr. Shi Tan, one of the organizers of this wonderful event. So Shi, here you go. You can ask the final question.
Gosh, that's a lot of pressure. First of all, thank you so much, Barclay, for this wonderful book. And I felt that I learned a lot. I was kind of struck by your comment that you want to be the first person to write the story. And as a fellow author of, I don't know, various things, this is very much prized in research culture. But in the wake of lots of conversations about lane policing and representation, how do you feel the story would have been told differently or similarly by someone with lived experience, whether mixed race or people who identify as Chinese or Southeast Asian or East Asian in this country?
Well, I mean, without a doubt, they would have had to have in their head the kind of racism they experienced, and that would have bound to have led to sort of different chapters, different things read. Because I was as aware as I hope I was that I didn't have that experience, I stuck to pretty factual stories. Basically, I was just telling what I found was basically taking things out of newspapers and bringing them into a different light. I think it would probably be very hard for somebody who came from a Chinese background not to have started to make judgments about that. I tried to not make judgments, although a few of mine drift in. But yeah, I mean, if you'd experienced it, you'd feel differently. You would understand some of it better than I clearly did, which is why I've said when I've done all my talks, I hope other people take this forward. I mean, I don't see any of my book as copyright in that sort of sense. If other people want to use material and draw on it, I'm more than welcome. And of course, the other book, The Chinese in Britain, that I referred to at the start, that does touch much more on those socioeconomic issues, which are kind of there a wee bit in my book, but not to any extent. All I've experienced is a Scot in England, and that's quite different.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think we should be satisfied with all the wonderful efforts made by Barclay here. So thank you very much for this wonderful talk and all the responses to the questions. I think it's very clearly that, to me at least anyway, this book certainly the beginning of big project rather than the end of projects. And I hope we will see perhaps Chinese translations into Chinese in the near future. So thank you again, Barclay, for giving us this wonderful time this afternoon. Before we go, perhaps Hongwei or Shi would like to have something to share, more information to share before we terminate today's meeting. I don't know whether Hongwei or Shi will have anything to say.
Yes. So let me just talk about this book. This book is available on Amazon, or probably you can order through your local bookshops. And it's really reader friendly and it's very informative. I've learned a lot. So thank you, Barclay, for conducting the research and for delivering this wonderful talk. And also thank Wei Ping for chairing this. And my other thanks first go to Roy Holloway University and University Nottingham, as well as COVID-19 anti-racism group, CARG, so for supporting this event. So final.
You are on mute.
Okay, so the final announcement. So the first one is a lot of people are concerned about the recording of the event. So we deliver the event as an education event, and we would like to have as many people learn about the history as possible. So after the event, I'm going to email the event video link to all those who have registered. So if you are on the mail list, you should be able to receive a link. Please feel free to distribute the link to anybody who might be interested in the information, and encourage them to read the book. So that's one channel. And the other thing, we'll also be distributing the video link on the CARC social media, as well as Stop Asian Hate social media and University Nottingham website. So there will be plenty of chance to share the information. So that's the first announcement. The second one is there is a forthcoming event next month on the Chinese student stereotypes in Britain. I mean, a lot of us have the kind of experience of being seen as Chinese student, wrongly or rightly, and were equated with some stereotypes. So we're going to talk about that in next month's event. And the event registration is still open, and the registration link is in the chat. So that's a second thing. The third announcement is we have a survey with regard to East Asian and Southeast Asian people's experience of racism and hate crimes in the UK. And this is an anonymous and voluntary survey, and the survey result will be shared among participants after the event. So it only has 10 questions, which will take 5 minutes. So I appreciate that everybody, if you have time and interest, please complete the survey. So thanks very much. That's all I want to say. Shi, do you have any concluding remarks?
No, just to say thank you all, and also to Barclay and Wei Ping for being here today. And we are really happy that we have a good crowd, and we hope that this community can grow and that it can become more diverse in its voices and expressions, and continue to raise really important questions. I think quite a lot of questions in the chat we couldn't cover. So maybe in the future seminars, we can revisit them again. And by all means, I think Barclay is completely contactable. So yeah, we will be in touch one way or another. And thank you for joining us today. And I will be shortly closing this Zoom room. So
thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.